there is a stretch of ground east of the Mediterranean coast where, if you stand still long enough on a clear morning, you can almost feel the weight of everything that ever passed through it. Caravans, armies, refugees, priests carrying jars of oil, merchants with cedar planks lashed to the backs of donkeys. This is the land the older Hebrew texts simply call Canaan, the land that would become the testing ground for one of the most uncomfortable passages in the entire Bible, Leviticus chapter 18. Most readers approach that chapter the way a person approaches a locked room, carefully, from a distance, hoping not to have to go inside. The prohibitions feel ancient and harsh, the warnings sound severe. The closing image of a land that vomits out its inhabitants sits in the mind long after the page has turned. And yet the chapter was not written in a vacuum. It was written against something, against a real civilization, with real cities, real temples, real priests, and real economic systems that had grown around a religion the Hebrew writers considered not merely wrong, but actively destructive to human life. To understand what Leviticus 18 was trying to interrupt, you have to understand who the Canaanites actually were. Not the caricature, not the shadow figure used in sermons, the actual people, their language, which was a cousin of Hebrew and could be read by an Israelite without too much trouble, their farming calendar, which dictated when rituals happened and why, their political situation, which was fragmented and anxious and constantly under pressure from larger empires, their gods, who were not invented out of cruelty, but out of a deep and very human attempt to make sense of drought, fertility, death, and the unpredictable rains that decided whether a village ate that year or starved. This is where the story has to begin, not with judgment, with geography. Chapter 1. The land between three continents. Canaan was small. That has to be said first. The entire region, from the foothills of Lebanon down through the Negev, could be crossed on foot in a matter of weeks. Yet that small strip of ground held a position no other land in the ancient world can match. It was the only land bridge connecting Africa to Asia, and through Asia to Europe. Every army that wanted to march from Egypt to Mesopotamia had to cross it. Every merchant carrying tin from the north to the southern markets had to pass through it. Every idea, every god, every disease, every technology eventually traveled along its roads. Two of those roads mattered above all others. The Via Maris, the way of the sea, ran along the coast and connected the Nile Delta to the cities of the north. The King's Highway ran inland, east of the Jordan, linking the Red Sea trade to Damascus and beyond. Whoever controlled the cities along those two routes controlled the wealth of the ancient Near East, and the cities along those routes, Jericho, Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, Gaza, became some of the most fortified, most contested, most repeatedly destroyed urban centers in human history. The land itself was a study in contrast. To the west, the coastal plain rose into gentle hills, then climbed into a central ridge of limestone mountains where the rains gathered. To the east, those mountains fell away sharply into the deep scar of the Jordan Rift, the lowest land surface on earth. The Jezreel Valley, broad and fertile, cut across the north like a green corridor. South of it, the highlands grew rocky and stubborn, suitable for olives and grapes but not for grain. Further south still, the land turned into desert, and the desert turned into wilderness, and the wilderness eventually became Sinai. The Hebrew Bible calls this land flowing with milk and honey. The phrase has been spiritualized so often that the literal meaning has nearly been lost. Milk meant herds. Honey, in that period, more likely referred to date syrup than to the product of bees. Together, the words described a land that could sustain both pastoral and agricultural life. A land where a family with a few goats and a small terraced field could survive. By the standards of the ancient world, this was extraordinary. Most of the surrounding regions could do one or the other. Canaan could do both. But abundance came with conditions. The rains were not reliable. 2 seasons of drought could empty a village. The fields depended on the early rains of October and the late rains of April. If either failed, the harvest failed. If both failed, people died. This is not a minor detail. It is the key that unlocks everything that follows. The religion of Canaan was, at its core, a religion of rain. The Canaanites themselves were never a single nation. They were in network, a confederation of city-states and tribal groupings sharing a language, a script, a pantheon, and a set of cultural assumptions, but rarely sharing a king. Ugarit on the northern coast operated as one polity. Hazor in the Galilee operated as another. Jerusalem, before David took it, was a small Jebusite stronghold with its own ruler. The Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon were independent maritime powers. Inland, smaller tribal groups, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, occupied the spaces between the major centers. This fragmentation had consequences. It meant that when an outside power pressed in, Egypt from the south, Hittites from the north, Assyrians from the east, the Canaanites could not respond as a single body. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic tablets recovered from the ruins of an Egyptian capital, capture this vividly. Local Canaanite kings write to the pharaoh in tones that swing between flattery and panic. They beg for soldiers, they accuse their neighbors of treachery, they report invasions by a shadowy group called the Habiru, whose precise identity scholars still debate. The picture that emerges is not of a confident civilization at its height. It is of a fractured society, aware that its position between empires made it constantly vulnerable. That vulnerability shaped the religion. When you live on land that any larger power can take, when your harvest depends on rains you cannot predict, when your neighbors might raid your village before the next moon, the gods you turn to are not abstract philosophical concepts. They are powers you bargain with, powers you feed, powers you try to keep on your side at almost any cost. This is the soil in which the worship of Baal and Asherah and Molech grew, not in a vacuum of cruelty, in a real, anxious, agricultural world where survival felt thin and the priests promised that the right rituals, performed at the right times, could hold the thinness at bay. To approach Leviticus 18 without understanding that pressure is to misread it from the first verse. The chapter was not addressing strangers. It was addressing a people who had just spent generations in Egypt, were about to enter Canaan, and who would face every single one of these temptations not as exotic foreign customs, but as the practical, everyday neighborhood religion of the families living next door. Chapter 2. The gods who lived in the rain. The Canaanite pantheon was not a tidy system. It grew slowly, absorbing local cults, blending older Semitic figures with newer arrivals, shifting in importance as different cities rose and fell. By the time the Israelites entered the land, the system had its main shape, and that shape can be drawn with some confidence thanks to the tablets recovered from a city called Ugarit on the northern Syrian coast. At the top sat El. The name is almost identical to one of the Hebrew words for God, and the connection is not accidental. El was the old high god of the West Semitic peoples, the father of the gods, the wise elder, the one whose decree the others were supposed to obey. In the Ugaritic texts, El lives in a tent or a tabernacle at the source of two rivers. He is bearded, dignified, slow to anger. But he is also strangely passive. He blesses, he approves, he rarely acts. The actual drama of the divine world happens among his children. Chief among those children was Baal. The name itself simply means Lord or Master, which is why it appears so often in biblical texts as a kind of generic title attached to local versions. Baal of Peor, Baal Vijab, Baal Berith. But behind the title stood a specific god, the storm rider, the one who hurled lightning, broke the clouds, brought the rain. In the agricultural mind of Canaan, Baal was the god who made life possible. Without him, the fields stayed brown. The myths recovered from Ugarit tell his story in a sequence that anyone living in a Mediterranean climate would recognize. Baal fights and defeats Yam, the chaotic god of the sea, asserting order over the watery threat that surrounded the land. He builds himself a palace on Mount Zaphon, the great peak in northern Syria. He sends the rains. The fields flourish. Then Mot, the god of death, summons him to the underworld. Baal descends. The rains stop. The land withers. The summer drought every year was the time when Baal was thought to be dead. His sister Anat, fierce and bloody in the texts, eventually finds Moat, splits him with a blade, scatters him, grinds him, sows him in the field. Baal returns. The autumn rains fall. The cycle begins again. Read carefully. This is not a primitive story. It is a sophisticated theological explanation for one of the deepest mysteries of agricultural life. Why does the land die every summer and live again every winter? The answer the Canaanites gave was that the god dies and rises. And the rituals that accompanied this myth were not casual. They were urgent. Every detail of the farming year, when to plow, when to plow, when to plow, when to harvest, when to bring the first fruits, was tied to a sacred calendar designed to keep Baal favorable. Beside Baal stood Asherah. She was older, perhaps originally the consort of El, but in the Iron Age she became increasingly linked with Baal and with the fertility of crops, herds, and human reproduction. Her symbol was a stylized tree or a wooden pole, what the Hebrew Bible calls an Asherah, set up beside altars and at high places. Excavations have recovered hundreds of small clay figurines, mostly female, mostly emphasizing the breasts and hips, that scholars believe represent her or a household version of her cult. They were kept in ordinary homes. They were touched daily. They were part of the texture of common life. The worship of Asherah was not separate from sexuality. Some of the rituals associated with her involved what the biblical texts call chedishim and kedishot, terms usually translated as cult prostitutes, though the exact nature of their role is still discussed among scholars. Some argue that the institution was straightforwardly sexual sacred rites, in which worshippers united with temple functionaries in the belief that the act would stimulate the fertility of the land. Others believe the picture is more complicated, that the term referred to consecrated personnel whose duties were broader than the sexual reading suggests. The Hebrew Bible, however, treats the institution with absolute hostility, and the language it uses leaves little doubt that whatever was happening, it was understood as a profound violation of the boundaries the Israelite tradition was trying to draw. Then there was Mot, the god whose name simply means death. Mot did not require temples in the same way. He required fear. The Ugaritic texts describe him with a mouth that reaches from the earth to the sky, a hunger that nothing satisfies. To live under the shadow of Mot was to live with the constant awareness that the underworld was patient, that it would receive everyone eventually, and that gestures of appeasement might delay the moment. And finally, on the edge of this pantheon sits the figure whose name later generations would speak almost in a whisper, Molech. The Hebrew spelling itself is a kind of theological insult. The consonants of the word for king, Melech, deliberately given the vowels of the word for shame, Boshet. Whether Molech was originally a distinct god, a title for a particular underworld deity, or a term for a type of sacrifice, scholars continue to debate. What they do not debate, after a century of excavation, is that the practice associated with his name involved the burning of infants. The texts speak of passing children through fire. The phrase is deliberately spare. It refuses to dwell on the act. But the archaeological record has been less restrained. We will come to that record. For now, it is enough to say that this was the religion the Israelites were warned about, not a religion of joyful nature worship, a religion in which, at the most extreme edge, the most defenseless members of the community could be placed on an altar to secure the favor of a god. Beside these major figures stood a host of smaller ones. Dagon, the grain god, particularly important among the Philistines. Resheph, a god of plague and warfare. Shahar and Shalim, gods of dawn and dusk. Kafarwa Karsis, the divine craftsmen who build Baal's palace. Each had a place, each had a ritual. Each was woven into the rhythm of a year that began and ended with anxious watching of the sky. This was not a system that any individual could simply opt out of. To stop participating in the rituals was to stop participating in the agricultural community itself. The festivals were also the markets. The processions were also the political assemblies. The high places were also the gathering points where marriages were arranged and disputes were settled. To say no to Baal was to step outside the structure of life as everyone you knew understood it, which is exactly what Leviticus 18 was about to ask the Israelites to do. Chapter 3. What the tablets at Ugarit. Finally, aside from most of recorded history, Almost everything known about Canaanite religion came from one source, the Hebrew Bible. And because the Bible was the source, scholars for centuries had no way to test whether its descriptions were accurate, exaggerated, or distorted by polemical purpose. Skeptical voices in the 19th century suggested that the biblical writers had invented much of what they described, painting their neighbors in deliberately monstrous colors to justify the conquest narratives and the harshness of the law codes. That argument collapsed in the spring of 1928. A farmer in northern Syria, ploughing a field near a small bay on the Mediterranean coast, struck a stone slab with his plough. Beneath it lay a tomb. Beneath the tomb lay the buried remains of an entire city. The site was called Ras Shamra in modern Arabic. In antiquity it had been Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the late Bronze Age. What the excavators found over the following decades transformed the field. Palaces, temples, harbors, residential quarters, libraries, and in those libraries, thousands of clay tablets, many of them written in a previously unknown cuneiform alphabet that turned out to be a close cousin of Hebrew. Once the script was deciphered, the tablets began to speak. And what they said was that the biblical writers had not been exaggerating. The Baal cycle, the most famous of the Ugaritic literary texts, described the storm god in terms remarkably close to those the prophets had been polemicizing against for centuries. The pantheon was structured exactly as the biblical writers had assumed. El was the high god. Baal rode the clouds. Asherah was a major figure. The seasonal myth of death and resurrection matched the agricultural anxieties the Hebrew texts had attacked. Even smaller details aligned. The Ugaritic phrase Arp, rider of the clouds, used as a title for Baal, appeared in modified form in the Psalms, applied instead to the God of Israel as a deliberate theological counterclaim. The legal and ritual tablets added more layers. They described sacrificial calendars, priestly duties, festival cycles, and the precise offerings expected at each shrine. Some of those offerings were ordinary: cattle, sheep, grain, oil, wine. Others were stranger. There were rituals for warding off household ghosts, rituals for ensuring that a deceased king would receive his place among the divine ancestors, rituals tied to specific astronomical events. The religion of Ugarit was not casual. It was comprehensive, organized, and supported by a literate priestly class that kept careful records. There were also texts that revealed the social cost of the system. Legal documents from Ugarit show that temples held vast tracts of land, controlled significant portions of the local economy, and employed large numbers of dependent workers. The line between religious devotion and economic obligation was thin. To live in Ugarit was to live inside the temple economy, whether one wanted to or not. The discoveries at Ugarit were soon supplemented by finds elsewhere. At Ebla in northern Syria, a much earlier archive revealed Semitic religious practices going back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. At Mari on the Euphrates, royal correspondence illuminated the political and religious life of the wider region. At sites throughout the southern Levant, Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Gezer, Tel Dan, excavators uncovered temples, altars, standing stones, cult objects, and inscriptions that filled in the picture sketched at Ugarit. One of the most striking finds came not from a temple, but from a series of small inscriptions at a remote desert site called Kuntilat Adrut in the Sinai. The inscriptions, dated to roughly the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era, mention not only Yahweh, the God of Israel, but also, in the same phrase, his Asherah. Scholars have argued for decades about what exactly this means. Some read it as evidence that a popular form of Israelite religion incorporated a goddess figure alongside Yahweh, the very practice that the prophets thundered against. Others read it more carefully as a reference to a cult object associated with Yahweh rather than to a separate deity. The debate has not been settled, but the inscriptions confirmed that the boundary the biblical writers wanted to draw between Israelite worship and Canaanite worship was not a boundary that was easily maintained on the ground. It had to be argued for, it had to be enforced, it had to be reasserted in every generation. The picture that emerges from the archaeology is not the picture of a clean dichotomy between pure Israelites on one side and corrupt Canaanites on the other. It is the picture of a small, struggling people trying to hold a distinct theological identity inside a much larger cultural field that constantly pulled them back toward the practices of their neighbors. The conquest narratives in Joshua and the warnings in Leviticus and Deuteronomy were not addressing a problem that had been solved long ago. They were addressing a problem that the writers of those texts knew from painful experience was never going to be solved easily. The story of King Ahab in the 9th century before the Common Era illustrates this with painful clarity. Ahab built a temple to Baal in Samaria. His Phoenician wife Jezebel imported priests of Baal and Asherah by the hundreds. The court of Israel in that generation was indistinguishable in many respects from the courts of Tyre and Sidon. The confrontation between the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, recorded in the first book of Kings, was not a clash between Israel and a foreign religion. It was a clash inside Israel itself between two visions of what the people were supposed to be. When Elijah challenged the assembled crowd with the famous line, "If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him," the silence the text records is not the silence of a people who had never considered the alternative. It is the silence of a people who had been holding both options in their hands for generations and did not know how to put one of them down. This is the cultural reality behind every word of Leviticus 18. The chapter was not written for theologians. It was written for farmers, soldiers, mothers, traders, and priests who were going to wake up every morning surrounded by neighbors whose religion offered things their own religion did not. Predictable rain rituals, fertility magic, erotic worship, powerful spectacle, and at the extreme edge, the terrible promise that the most desperate sacrifice could buy the most desperate favor. Chapter 4. The Fire at the Edge of the City. There is a place on the western edge of modern Tunisia where the ground gives up evidence that for 2 centuries scholars argue bitterly about. The site is Carthage, the great Phoenician colony founded by settlers from Tyre, and the evidence is a precinct the excavators came to call the Tophet. The Tophet at Carthage lies in a quiet area of the ancient city, away from the main public spaces. Below the surface, layer upon layer, archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of small ceramic urns. Inside the urns are burned bones. Most of the bones belong to infants, some only days old. Some belong to young children. A smaller number belong to small animals, usually lambs or kid goats. Above many of the urns, when the excavators were fortunate, they found inscribed stones called stelae, dedicated to 2 deities whose names appear again and again, Baal Hammon and Tanit. The inscriptions follow a pattern. A worshipper records the name of the deity, the name of the dedicator, and a phrase that scholars have come to call the Molech formula, from a Punic word that appears to be the linguistic cousin of the Hebrew Molech. For decades, the meaning of these finds was contested. Some scholars argued that the Tophet was simply an infant cemetery, that the high infant mortality of the ancient world explained the concentration of remains, and that the inscriptions referred to ordinary burial dedications rather than to ritual killing. Others, reading the same evidence, argued that the combination of the inscriptions, the specific patterning of the deposits, the absence of any comparable adult cemetery in the same location, and the consistent ritual character of the urns pointed unmistakably to sacrifice. The debate has not entirely ended, but the balance has shifted. Careful osteological analysis of the bones has shown that many of the infants were healthy at the time of death, that the burning occurred shortly after death, and that the patterns of breakage on the bones match what would be expected from ritual cremation rather than from natural mortality followed by funerary cremation. The dedicatory inscriptions, when read in context with similar inscriptions from other Phoenician colonies, make most sense as records of a vow fulfilled. The worshipper had promised the deity a particular gift, and the inscription records that the promise had been kept. Classical sources from the Greek and Roman worlds describe the practice directly. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, recounts that during a siege of Carthage by the Sicilian tyrant Agathocles, the city's leaders concluded that their misfortunes were the result of having substituted children of slaves for the noble children that the deity Cronus, the Greek equivalent of Baal Hammon, was supposed to receive. To make amends, they assembled 200 children of the leading families and offered them publicly. Plutarch, writing later, describes parents standing without tears as the rite was performed, watched by officials who would have struck them if they had wept. These accounts were dismissed for a long time as Greek and Roman propaganda against a defeated enemy. The excavations at the Tophet have made that dismissal much harder to maintain. The classical texts and the archaeological record now point in the same direction, and the direction is not pleasant. What matters for the reading of Leviticus 18 is that the practice the biblical text condemns under the name of Molech was not a fantasy. It was a real ritual, performed in real Phoenician and Punic communities, sustained over centuries, embedded in the religious infrastructure of cities that the Israelites knew by name. The Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, from which Carthage was founded, were the same cities that traded with Solomon, that supplied the cedar for the temple, and that, in the generation of Ahab and Jezebel, sent their princesses and their priests into the heart of Israelite political life. The biblical prohibition was not addressing a distant horror. It was addressing a possibility that any Israelite city could face, that any desperate Israelite parent could be tempted by, and that any Israelite king who wanted to imitate the religious fashions of his more powerful neighbors might consider. The history of Israel itself confirms how real the temptation was. The second book of Kings records that King Ahaz of Judah passed his own son through the fire. King Manasseh, his grandson, did the same. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in the final years before the Babylonian destruction, accuses the people of Jerusalem of having built high places in the valley of Hinnom, just outside the city walls, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. He says, in a phrase that should stop the reader cold, that this was something Yahweh had never commanded and something that had never come into his mind. The valley of Hinnom, in Hebrew Yehinnom, would later become the source of the New Testament word Gehenna, the place name that came to stand for the deepest possible image of judgment. The geography itself remembered what had happened there. This is the weight behind the line in Leviticus that forbids giving any of your offspring to Molech. It is not abstract, it is a specific instruction issued to a specific people who lived within walking distance of altars where it was being done. The instruction was not received with relief. It was received with resistance. Generation after generation, the resistance continued until the city of Jerusalem was burned and its people carried into exile, and the prophets, looking back, named the burning of children among the central reasons. Chapter 5. The architecture of Leviticus 18. To read Leviticus 18, well, you have to read it as architecture, not as a list. The chapter is built. Every part holds up the other parts. Remove any one of them and the whole structure shifts. It opens with a frame. The voice that speaks identifies itself. I am Yahweh your God. The phrase is not a flourish. It is the foundation of everything that follows. The chapter is not presenting itself as the wisdom of a sage, or the consensus of a council, or the inherited custom of a tribe. It is presenting itself as the direct speech of the God who brought the people out of Egypt, and is about to bring them into Canaan. The legitimacy of the laws rests entirely on the identity of the speaker. Then comes the geographic frame. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. The Israelites are positioned between two cultures. Behind them, Egypt with its own complex sexual and religious practices. Ahead of them, Canaan with the practices we have been describing. The law is not asking them to invent something new. It is asking them to refuse two existing models and to follow a third. The third is summarized in a single phrase that runs like a refrain through the chapter and the chapters around it. You shall be holy. The Hebrew word is kadosh. Its root meaning is not what most modern readers assume. It does not mean morally good in the abstract. It means set apart, designated for a particular purpose, distinct from common use. A vessel in the temple was kadosh because it was reserved for sacred service. A day was kadosh because it was distinguished from ordinary days. A people could be kadosh because they were called to a function and a character that distinguished them from the nations around them. The implications of this word are easy to miss. To be kadosh is not first to be ethically superior. It is first to be different, visibly, behaviorally recognizably different. The ethical content of the difference matters intensely, but the ethical content is shaped by the prior call to distinction. The Israelites were being told that their entire identity as a people would be defined by their willingness to do what the surrounding cultures did not do, and to refuse what the surrounding cultures embraced. After the frame comes the body of the chapter. The longest section is a series of prohibitions on sexual relationships within the family. Father, mother, stepmother, sister, half-sister, granddaughter, aunt, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law. The list is meticulous. It moves outward from the closest relationships to the wider kinship circle, naming each forbidden relation in turn. The repetition has often been read as merely legal pedantry. It is not. It is the careful drawing of a wall. The reason for the wall becomes clearer when the surrounding cultures are considered. Egyptian royal practice included sibling marriage as a matter of dynastic policy. Hittite and Mesopotamian legal codes permitted forms of polygamous and incestuous arrangements that the Hebrew text refuses. The Canaanite texts from Ugarit describe the gods themselves engaging in relationships that, transferred to the human plane, would have fallen squarely under the prohibitions of Leviticus. The chapter is not addressing private moral hygiene. It is rebuilding the architecture of the family from the ground up. Why begin there? Because in the ancient world, as in the modern, the family was the smallest unit of society and the deepest carrier of its values. If the boundaries inside the family were unclear, every other boundary in society became negotiable. If a father could claim sexual access to a daughter or a stepdaughter, the power of the father became unlimited, and the daughter became property rather than person. If marriages could be arranged across generations and inside the closest bloodlines, the protection that family was supposed to offer to the most vulnerable members collapsed. The chapter is, among other things, a defense of the family against the family. After the family laws come 3 further prohibitions, each marked by its own weight. The first is the prohibition against sexual relations during a woman's menstrual period, a law tied to the larger purity system of the priestly tradition and to the protection of women from being treated as continuously available. The second is the prohibition against adultery, named simply and without elaboration. The third is the prohibition against giving children to Molech. That third prohibition sits in the middle of the chapter for a reason. It is the hinge. It is the moment when the chapter moves from family ethics into the deepest religious ground. The prohibition is followed by the words, "You shall not profane the name of your God." The implication is that to give a child to Molech is not only to commit a crime against the child, it is to drag the name of the God of Israel into the same category as the God who receives such offerings. It is to misrepresent who Yahweh is. After Molech, 2 further prohibitions complete the structure. The prohibition against male homosexual acts, framed in the language of the chapter's wider concern with the boundaries of sexual relationship, and the prohibition against bestiality, framed as a confusion of the categories of creation. Both are presented within the same architecture as the earlier prohibitions, as parts of the same effort to draw lines that the surrounding cultures had not drawn. How modern readers should understand these particular prohibitions is one of the most debated questions in contemporary biblical scholarship. The text leaves room for disagreement on application. Some readers argue that the prohibitions remain binding in their plain sense across all generations. Others argue that they were addressed to specific cultic practices in the Canaanite context, particularly the temple sexuality associated with the worship of Asherah, and that their force in other contexts is more limited. Still others read them within the wider framework of priestly purity laws, many of which the church and the synagogue have understood differently across the centuries. The text leaves room for disagreement here. Honest reading requires acknowledging the debate rather than dissolving it. The chapter closes with the most striking image in the entire passage. The land itself, the writer says, became defiled by the practices of its previous inhabitants, and the land vomited them out. The Hebrew verb is physical. It is the verb used for what a sick body does. The image is of the land as a living thing that cannot keep down what poisons it. The Israelites are warned that the same thing will happen to them if they imitate what came before. The land will not respect their lineage. The land will not protect them by virtue of their having entered. The land has, in this image, its own kind of moral integrity. Sustained violation will produce sustained rejection. This image runs deeper than it first appears. It connects to a thread that runs through the whole Hebrew Bible, the idea that creation itself responds to human action, that injustice damages the ground, that the cries of the wronged reach into the soil. The vomiting land is not a metaphor invented for shock. It is the priestly tradition's way of saying that there are limits built into the world itself, that those limits are not infinitely flexible, and that the people about to enter Canaan needed to know it. Chapter 6. The word the translators cannot soften. There is a particular Hebrew word that runs underneath the entire chapter, sometimes named, sometimes implied. The word is tiva. In English Bibles, it is usually rendered abomination. The translation is not wrong, but it has flattened a word that originally carried more texture than modern English allows. Toeva is not the strongest Hebrew word for moral evil. It is something different. It is a word that names something as a violation of an established order, as a crossing of a line that the speaker considers sacred. In some contexts, the word is used by foreigners about practices they find repulsive. The Egyptians, the book of Genesis tells us, considered shepherding to be tuva. They were not making a moral judgment about the goodness of shepherds. They were registering a cultural and ritual incompatibility. Shepherds belonged to a class of person. Their culture had reasons to keep at a distance. When the priestly writer uses tuva for the practices of the Canaanites, the word carries that same dual force. It names them as morally wrong, but it also names them as fundamentally incompatible with the structure the Israelites were being asked to inhabit. They were not just bad. They were out of place. They did not belong in the architecture being built. This matters for how the chapter should be read. The prohibitions are not free-floating moral pronouncements applicable in any context to any people. They are presented as the specific obligations of a specific community called to a specific kind of distinctness. The wider moral force of the chapter, its insistence on the protection of children, on the integrity of the family, on the limits to what may be done in the name of religion, has a universal weight that has shaped law and ethics far beyond the borders of ancient Israel. But the chapter itself is addressing one people, in one moment, at one specific border crossing. There is another word that deserves attention, the word chukim. Often translated statutes or decrees. The chapter says, "You shall not walk in their chukim." The word can mean a law in the formal sense, but it can also mean an established custom, a pattern of behavior so deeply rooted in a culture that it is followed without reflection. To walk in someone's chukim is to live according to their unspoken assumptions, to take their answers for granted, to inherit their categories without examining them. The chapter is, among many other things, an invitation to examine inherited categories. The Israelites were being told that simply because something had always been done in the land they were entering did not mean it should be done. Simply because the priests of Baal claimed religious authority for their rituals did not mean that authority was real. Simply because the surrounding cultures had organized their families and their economies and their worship in certain ways did not mean those ways had to be accepted. This was a radical demand in the ancient world. Most cultures derived their authority from custom. The older a practice was, the more legitimate it was assumed to be. The Hebrew tradition was asserting something different. It was claiming that custom could be wrong, that an entire civilization could be in error, that the age of a practice was no defense against the question of whether the practice was just. The early church fathers, reading these chapters centuries later, often noticed the rhetorical force of this move. The 4th century writer Cyril of Alexandria, commenting on the priestly laws, observed that the prohibitions were aimed not merely at the acts they named, but at the assumptions that made those acts seem normal. The Antiochene tradition, in writers like Theodoret of Cyrus, emphasized the way the laws were calibrated to the specific cultural diseases of the surrounding nations, designed to inoculate the Israelite community against the particular pressures they were going to face. Origen, in his idiosyncratic way, read the chapters as containing multiple layers, the literal and the spiritual together, and warned that any reading which collapsed all the layers into one would lose much of what the text was doing. Jewish tradition, with its longer continuous engagement with the text, developed an enormous interpretive literature around these chapters. The rabbis distinguished between laws that were considered self-evident on rational grounds, which they called mishpatim, and laws that were considered binding by divine decree, even when their reasons were not fully accessible to human reflection, which they called chukim in a more technical sense. Leviticus 18 contains both. The rabbis argued that this mixture was itself meaningful. Some prohibitions in the chapter, they noted, would be recognized as binding by any reasonable human community. Even one was no direct knowledge of the God of Israel. Others required the community to trust the framework even where the framework asked for something that did not arise naturally from common moral intuition. The history of how these chapters have been read is itself a long and complicated story. Different communities in different centuries have emphasized different elements. Some have used the chapters primarily as the basis for codes of personal conduct. Others have used them as the foundation of legal systems. Others have read them primarily as theological declarations about the nature of God and the structure of creation. The text has supported all of these readings, sometimes uncomfortably, and the church and the synagogue have continued to argue about which readings carry the most weight. What cannot be argued away is the central insistence. There are practices the chapter refuses. There are arrangements it will not accept. There is a line, drawn in language that the original audience could not have misunderstood, between what the Israelite community was to be and what the cultures around it had become. The chapter does not pretend the line is invisible or merely symbolic. It treats the line as real. Chapter 7. What the land remembers. The Israelites who first heard Leviticus 18 did not keep its commands perfectly. The biblical writers themselves are the most honest witnesses to this failure. Generation after generation, the prophets named the practices that had crept back in: high places built on every hill, sacred poles erected beside the altars of Yahweh. Children passed through the fire in the valley of Hinnom, priests of Baal eating at the king's table. The people who had been called to be different had, in the eyes of the prophets, become indistinguishable from the people they had been sent to replace. The consequences came. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians in the late 8th century before the Common Era. The southern kingdom of Judah held on for another century and a half before falling to the Babylonians. The temple was burned. The leaders were carried into exile. The land, in the language the prophets had inherited from Leviticus, vomited its inhabitants. The image that had been a warning became, in the eyes of the writers who survived the catastrophe, a description. What is striking in the exilic and post-exilic literature is that the prophets, looking back, did not soften the warning. They did not conclude that the standard had been too high. They did not argue that Leviticus 18 had asked for something unreasonable. They concluded the opposite. The catastrophe, they said, had come because the warning had been ignored. The land had done what the chapter said it would do. This is not an easy theological move. It places enormous weight on the relationship between human action and historical consequence. It refuses to allow the people to read their own suffering as merely the result of political accident or imperial ambition. It insists that something real had been violated and that the violation had real costs. Modern readers approach this kind of claim with caution, and rightly. History is rarely simple. Empires rise and fall for many reasons. To read every national disaster as the result of moral failure is to risk a kind of crude theodicy that the biblical tradition itself, in books like Job and Ecclesiastes, repeatedly resists. The prophets themselves, in their best moments, were aware of this. They did not flatten the catastrophe into a simple moral lesson. They held it as a wound. They allowed it to remain partly mysterious, but they also refused to let the people pretend that nothing had been at stake. The figure of Rahab, the Canaanite woman in the book of Joshua who shelters the Israelite spies and is spared in the destruction of Jericho, deserves a place in any honest reading of this material. Rahab was a Canaanite. She belonged to the very culture the conquest narratives describe as under judgment. Yet she is named in the New Testament as an ancestor of the Messianic line, included by name in the opening genealogy of the Gospel of Matthew. Her story complicates any reading of Leviticus 18 that would reduce the chapter to a verdict on an entire ethnic group. The judgment, as Ezekiel would later insist with extraordinary force, was on persistent practice, not on lineage. The soul who sinned was the one who would die. The soul who turned would live. The categories were never as fixed as the surface of the conquest narratives might suggest. The story of the Gibeonites makes a similar point from a different angle. The Gibeonites, also Canaanites by descent, secured their survival through a piece of clever deception, presenting themselves to Joshua as travelers from a distant land. When the deception was discovered, Joshua did not annul the treaty he had made with them. He honored it, even though it had been made under false pretenses. The Gibeonites were absorbed into the community as temple servants. They became part of the story rather than disappearing from it. Centuries later, a famine in the time of David was attributed to a violation of the treaty by Saul, and the resolution involved restoring what had been owed to the Gibeonites. The land had remembered the wrong done to them. These narratives sit alongside the more difficult conquest texts as part of the same tradition. They do not resolve the difficulty, they complicate it in the way that honest tradition often does. The same canon that records the destruction of cities also records the inclusion of Canaanites who turned toward the God of Israel. The same texts that warn against the practices of the surrounding nations also record the prophets pleading with their own people not to become indistinguishable from those nations. The picture is not tidy. It refuses to flatten into propaganda in either direction. What can be said with confidence is that the chapter has continued to do work across the centuries that no one in its original audience could have imagined. The protections it built into the architecture of the family, the protections of children from sexual exploitation by their parents, the protections of the vulnerable from being absorbed into the religious economies of their masters, the protections of the most defenseless from being burned for the sake of agricultural anxiety, have shaped legal and moral systems far beyond the borders of any one tradition. The insistence that there are practices a community must refuse, no matter how widespread, no matter how economically profitable, no matter how religiously justified, has become one of the deep moral inheritances of the Western tradition, and through that tradition, of much of the wider world. The chapter has also done quieter work. It has named, with a clarity that few other ancient texts approach, the danger of religion that asks for the sacrifice of the helpless in order to secure the comfort of the powerful. Whenever a community in any century has been tempted to demand that the most vulnerable among them be offered up to the market, to the war, to the ideology, to the convenience of those who have more, as Leviticus 18 has stood in the background as a refusal. The God who speaks in the chapter does not accept that kind of offering. He never asked for it. According to the prophet Jeremiah, it never even came into his mind. There is one more thread to draw. The chapter, for all its severity, ends not with destruction, but with a strange and quiet implication. The land vomits its inhabitants. The people are warned, but the warning itself is an act of mercy. To name what will happen is to give the listener a chance to avoid it. The chapter is not the report of a punishment already imposed. It is the speech of a God who is still speaking, still naming the line, still inviting the people to choose differently. The fact that the warning had to be repeated by Moses, by Joshua, by Samuel, by Elijah, by Isaiah, by Jeremiah, generation after generation, is itself a kind of testimony. The speaker did not give up. If careful biblical reading of this kind matters to you, your thoughts in the comments help shape what comes next. The land remembers what was done on it. That is the conviction the chapter wants to leave with its hearers. The land remembers the children burned at its edges, the families broken inside its walls, the worship that turned worshippers into instruments. It remembers, and there are limits to how much it will hold. The Israelites were told before they ever crossed the Jordan that they would be living on ground that already had a memory. They were being asked to add a different memory to it, a memory of a people who refused certain things, who protected certain people, who drew certain lines and stayed inside them, who refused to call their God by names that belonged to other gods, who treated their children as a trust rather than a currency. The history that followed is the history of a people who often failed at this and sometimes succeeded. The chapter does not promise that the success will be easy or that the failure will be hidden. It promises something quieter, that the standard is real, that the speaker is real, that the difference being asked for is not arbitrary and not optional, but is the actual shape of what it would mean to be the kind of community that the speaker is forming. To read Leviticus 18 now, in any century, is to be addressed by that same speaker. The cultural pressures are different. The names of the gods have changed. The economic systems that ask for the sacrifice of the vulnerable look different from the temple economies of Bronze Age Canaan. But the underlying questions have not changed. What will this community refuse? What will it protect? Whose children will be considered worth the cost of saying no? What lines will be drawn between what is normal in the surrounding culture and what is acceptable for those who claim to be set apart? The chapter does not provide every answer. It provides the architecture inside which the answers have to be worked out. It hands the listener a frame. The frame is built of warnings, prohibitions, theological declarations, and the strange, uncomfortable, irreducible image of a land that has its own memory and its own limits. Inside that frame, every generation has been asked to draw its own lines, to refuse its own versions of Baal and Asherah and Molech, to defend its own vulnerable from the priests of its own age. The voice that opens the chapter has not stopped speaking. The land has not stopped remembering. And the question the chapter asks at its core remains the question that any honest reader has to face. Not what the Canaanites did in their cities long fallen to dust, but what we do in the cities we have built on the same ground.